All right. Welcome everyone to webinar 7 of our campaign. This is webinar 7 on public consultation on medical psilocybin regulations. Today is Wednesday, September 8th. Thank you very much everyone for joining this. I think we've got just about one more webinar before we wrap up our series here. So today we're going to learn more about the regulations that we put together and how we'll be reaching out to the public to get some feedback on those regulations. So again, thank you everyone for joining today. Just as a bit of housekeeping, I want to remind everyone that you can put any content or any comments you would like to make in the chat, but if you have questions, it would be awesome if you could put those in the Q&A below. In that Q&A, Holly will likely follow up after the presentation is done, and we'll make sure that we get to all of the questions that are in there. And if we miss any, it's a good way for us to record them and make sure that we either email you or put them on a Q&A somewhere so that you do get answers to them. So thank you very much, and feel free to throw in the chat where you're joining in from today. All right, so I'd first like to make the land acknowledgement and acknowledge that I am conducting this Zoom here in beautiful, lovely Victoria where the sun is shining. And I want to acknowledge that this is the ancestral and unceded territory of the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich people. Furthermore, I do want to acknowledge that the substance we're working with here, psilocybin, as we work to legalize it, we want to really acknowledge that the entire field of psychedelic medicine wouldn't exist without those that have kept knowledge and tradition alive so long. So thank you very much. So here's a quick agenda for today. I want to go through our speaker introduction. We're joined here by Jim and David, and we'll jump over to them to give a quick introduction. We'll go through our current campaign, regulations and updates, and then we'll go through and break down the regulations. And what we've done is taken the 165-page document we have. We've broken it down into about 9 sections, and we're going to go through those quickly and explain what those sections are in a digestible manner that you folks can understand. And then if you're interested further in it, you can go to those regulations and dig deeper. After that, we will answer some questions that we've got, and then we'll close up. And we're trying to close up this webinar today by around 4:30 to 4:45, as there is a debate tonight for the federal candidates. So let's see if we can get this started. Again, if you have questions at any point, throw them in the Q&A below. And first and foremost, I do want to introduce our speakers. So Jim, if you want to give yourself a quick introduction, that'd be great. Oh, and you're muted, Jim.
Hello, I'm Jim Doswell. I'm a patient at TheraPsil's. I'm awaiting an exemption from Canada. I've quit holding my breath, but we'll see. Anyway, and I have a fairly extensive background in government and stuff like that. And so we've been working together as a team on issues like these regulations and others. And I'll add where I can today. And that's about it. Thank you, Spencer.
Thank you, Jim. And it's really good to have you on another webinar. Over to you, David Wood.
Thank you. Very happy to be here. My name's David Wood. I'm General Counsel and Chief Legal Officer at Cygen Industries Limited. And I also run a small private practice called R Group Legal. Very much support expanded access to psychedelics and in particular psilocybin, and really hope that our efforts here contribute to getting patients what they need sooner.
Thank you very much, David. And I can confirm that they absolutely are. A little update here is this past week, we actually did get another Section 56 for another patient. So these efforts are working, and the government, even though it is an election, they do continue to support some individuals with their Section 56 applications, and our continued advocacy has sped it up, I hope, for many of those individuals. So as of today, we've helped 38 in total, 19 healthcare practitioners. However, these do not really reflect the true numbers. Out of those 19 healthcare practitioners, we've got about 80 plus. I think it's soon going to be about 180 healthcare practitioners that will be waiting on exemptions. We've also got 17 patients currently waiting on Section 56 exemptions, but that is in a queue of thousands who have reached out to us. Unfortunately, we're a small organization and unable to keep up with the demand from patients, which is why we've set our campaign goal and the goal of the organization to create regulations to better help Canadians get access to psilocybin. So that's what we're going to be talking about today, is those regulations that are there in order to ensure that all access to psilocybin meets the following criteria: that it's safe, so we have safe supply of psilocybin and trained healthcare practitioners to safely deliver it to patients, and also to make sure that there is equality, that it's timely, that patients get equal access to it, and predictable access, so we understand who and why they're getting psilocybin. So we want to work with the government, not against them, and that's why we've put together these regulations. It is a briefing for the new health minister, and as many people know, there is a election coming up on the 20th. So the plan with the public consultation that we'll be doing over the next couple of weeks is to make sure that the regulations we've put together are not only fully completed, but there's also feedback on them from stakeholders. So Jim, I'm wondering if I could just pass it over to you to first start off. What is the importance of having regulations for something like psilocybin? Why are regulations important in any level of government?
Well, regulations are basically, that's the rules by which government operates. It's similar, like, who hasn't been frustrated when they've spoken to a government agency and they say, well, our policy says. So policy and regulation are pretty much the same thing. They're not necessarily laws, but they might as well be, because that's how the government operates. And so by giving them a set of guidelines that are somewhat familiar to them because of the marijuana issues, you're able to give them a bit easier understood, I guess, set of rules by which they can operate and move forward without too much risk. And risk is not the friend of the civil servant. So this is a way that government can move forward. Regulations evolve around every aspect of law and every aspect of operation within the government. And so what to a great extent David and Spencer and Holly have done here is they put together a set of regulations that mirror very much mirror the regulations that have been used for marijuana. So familiarity for the federal government, very minimal risk, and yet the ability to change whatever they feel they may have screwed up the first time. And so it's the guidelines that they work with, basically.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Jim. And on the next slide here, people that want to see where they can find those regulations, there's a link here. And what I'll do is I will just paste in the chat quickly the link to those regulations as we've got them on our website. So if you're looking in the chat right now, you can follow that link. Essentially, we've put together these regulations, just as Jim's saying, to be administratively easy and to replace the Section 56 process that right now is failing patients. It is failing patients and healthcare practitioners, and we want to move it out of a system where the minister is the one giving access to psilocybin and move it in accordance with other laws such as cannabis to a system where the doctor is providing that access. David Wood, I want to make sure, did I miss anything here? And do you have any comments on why we need to move towards regulations more like cannabis instead of Section 56?
I mean, you got the main points. I'd say at this level of detail, safe, equal, and predictable access is not possible when it's an arbitrary decision in an ad hoc system that's not even designed for this. I mean, subsection 56(1) exemptions, the majority of them that have ever been issued are for research. That's kind of what they're intended for. And they were never intended to provide medical access to anything. Clearly, there's merit in providing medical access to psilocybin. And if we want to do this in what I believe would be the fastest, safe, and lowest cost way, it would be likely through a system very similar to cannabis, where you're providing this substance to people in a safe manner, despite the fact there's no health or therapeutic indication that's clearly associated with the products being provided. And from there, it's a lot of details that we're going to try and summarize in an accessible way over the next 20 minutes or so.
Thank you, David. And let's jump right into that, given the timing here. So again, for the folks on this call, essentially what we're going to try and do is take a 165-page document and break it down into about 9 different parts. And so what we'll do is we'll start going through those parts. I will quickly skim over what the heading of the part is and why we put it there. And David, I'll most likely be jumping back over you to explain some of this. And I want everyone to keep in mind as we're going through these that these regulations were not built from scratch. They're built off of the existing medical cannabis regulations. So much of these parts are here for a reason. They exist to be administratively easy and also more or less equivalent to existing cannabis regulations. So all of the things that took 20 years for us to put together for cannabis regs are already built into these psilocybin regulations. So let's jump in. And the first part is licensing. So in the part 1 of these proposed regulations, it discusses the licenses granted by Health Canada, which are required in order to produce or sell psilocybin. So this would be how to apply for licenses and what type of licenses there are. And these would be licenses for the sale of medical purposes. So David, why are licenses important?
Licenses are important because in order to generate products that are quality controlled in an effective way, it's critical to make sure that the corporations or potentially individuals, but more likely corporations that are producing these products are subject to regulation, and that the products have to be made in compliance with standards. A license, which is a privilege that can be taken away if it's abused or not complied with, is just a general legal concept to allow people to participate in any market that has special rules and production standards and controls that we want to see adhered to. And in this case, much like cannabis, we would have production licenses, which would allow anything from cultivation or organic synthesis to extraction to creation of products and to release of those products with quality assurance in a manner very, very analogous to cannabis cultivation licenses and processing licenses, but kind of moved into one. And I want to make it clear that we've also proposed that because psilocybin is a controlled substance, and we're not proposing to change that, since changing it from a status as a controlled substance would require amendment of the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, and could arguably have, well, not argue, would have implications for Canada's adherence to UN conventions. We've stayed completely within the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act here, and we've also proposed that only licensed dealers who are already authorized to possess psilocybin or applicants for a dealer's license who apply at the same time would be eligible to apply for either one of these licenses. And when they do, they'd be allowed to meet part of the supply chain, which we broke into production licenses, and that could be simply cultivation and nothing more, or it could be turning dried fruiting bodies into products, or it could be just storing products. It could be anything that the production license applicant was interested in, fulfilling as part of their role in the supply chain. And then a license for sale for medical purposes, again, looking to cannabis regulations, would simply be a license to sell products to individuals who have registered a medical document with the license holder. And as you said, administratively familiar to Health Canada because it follows the cannabis system very closely. And you wrote who grants my license. I would say that would be Health Canada, just like it is with cannabis. Because again, they're the regulator that are familiar with implementing a system like this.
Awesome. Thank you very much, David. And I want to remind everyone who's joining in here, if you have any questions regarding anything that's said or any parts of these, please feel free to throw those into the Q&A below. All right, so the next part is security clearances. And I guess it would make sense if you're going to go to the effort to have people license the production and sale of psilocybin, there are certainly security measures that need to be taken. After all, the fact that we have controlled substances likely is there because there is some level of necessary security to be taken with these substances. So In part 2 and 3 of our proposed regulations, we put out guidelines for license holders that state and stipulate essentially that those who do hold these licenses must take into account that they are controlling a substance that may pose risk to the public. And as such, they need to follow a certain set of stipulations and rules pertaining to the security of that substance. It also mentions that the minister may perform checks at any time. There are also security measures that are physical, and so those might prevent unauthorized access. It might stipulate site storage barriers and access to storage. Now, for those listening, and I guess for many people who have followed cannabis, I believe that there is quite a bit of controversy over security clearances and security access for cannabis. Why is security such an issue with Health Canada and when it comes to controlled substances? I mean, beyond the obvious, making them difficult for people to access, what level of security do you think would be necessary here, David?
We've again followed the cannabis regulations essentially identically in terms of security clearances. Again, because the regulators and the law enforcement officials who execute on security clearances, we want to give them something they're familiar with and the same set of rules. And then on the physical security measures, so that's security is important in that respect because we want to maintain the integrity of this system, prevent diversion into or out of this system. And then secondly, physical security is important, obviously, because these locations could be targets for robbery or other problems. As it is right now, licensed dealers have physical security requirements on the storage area of any controlled substances, and those would have to be complied with. But in addition, there'd be a layer of security required for these facilities that would be either storing or manufacturing psilocybin products from psilocybin material. And we've made those security requirements consistent with micro licenses under the cannabis regulations or nursery licenses under the cannabis regulations. And that's because we felt that the heightened level of security necessary with standard cultivation or processing licenses was perhaps beyond what was necessary, and that most of these corporations who could operate these licenses, if this is ever allowed, would be probably pretty interested in preventing any sort of theft in any event. So we felt that forcing them to comply with standard cultivation or standard processing licenses would likely just result in unnecessary overhead that would drive up the cost of the whole enterprise, drive up the cost of products, and probably not help anyone. So we felt that that level was acceptable.
Awesome. Thank you very much, David. For part 4,
I'm sorry. Just before we go to part 4, Spencer, if I might, all I would say too is there's another issue around security, and that is the single largest fear that a government has is to wake up one day and read the Globe and Mail and find out that they've given a license to the Hells Angels or someone else. And so the whole security issue and the whole security clearance issue is to try to ensure that there's no political exposure to criminal elements in Canada. And it's the unspoken aspect of, I guess, of security and licensing issues that that probably gets the sort of the sphincter of most politicians up to a degree that, you know, can really rile them. So I agree with everything David said. He's absolutely right. But the idea of government being found to have any partners in this who have any criminal background is a huge issue.
Well, thank you very much, Jim. And it is a good point to raise up. I know that already we've gotten some feedback asking about, you know, why we're following these measures. And I think it's always good to remember that, you know, many of the measures set out in these regulations for cannabis are there for a good reason. So that's very interesting, and thank you for bringing that up. So for part 4, we go into good production practices. And Jim, I'm gonna want to come to you for a question here, just after I explain what the good production practices are. So the idea here is that there should be set requirements for how psilocybin is produced by a licensed holder in accordance with good production practices. And so some of the outlying requirements for productions here may be things like sanitary conditions, acceptable levels of psilocybin or contaminants, and all of this is for the consumer's protection. So Jim, the reason I wanted to come back to you here is I know that we've had many conversations with patients, and just about, or in fact, every single person who's had a Section 56 exemption up until now has been forced to purchase psilocybin from the black market or gray market. How important do you think it is to make sure that we do have psilocybin that's following good production practices, and how important to a government and Health Canada should that be? Because right now there's none.
Yeah, exactly. Right now you can go to any number of online and physical stores in Vancouver, and I'm sure Toronto and other places, and buy mushrooms. Now, what you're doing is basically relying 100% on the decency of your dealer. And I don't know that that's always the safest thing to do, particularly in a product that can have such amazing medicinal effect as psilocybin can. So this is a little bit like, food and drug regulations. This is like food safety regulations. This is making sure that when you, as someone who is, going down this journey, can know that you're perfectly safe in what you're buying, and that you're not taking a risk that it's got fentanyl in it or anything else. I mean, this is, you're hopefully able to buy a pure product that the government has the opportunity to inspect and from time to time, as they do, and not become a statistic because of a tainted product of some type. And I live in Victoria, but I spent most of my life in Vancouver. And the amount of drugs that come into Vancouver from overseas that are illegal and synthesized and so on, and added to the drugs that are here and everything else is phenomenal. And so I can't think of anything that's much more important than this aspect of the regulations, to ensure that you're not going to get sick from anything you buy while you're trying to get better.
Thank you very much, Jim. And David, is there anything you wanted to add there?
I think we'll get into it more on the products one, but essentially, again, I'm repeating myself, but we followed the lead with cannabis, and we looked at the way it was built into the regulations, that there would be guarantees of certain quality standards based on requirements put on the processors. So in this case, on our production licenses, we wanted similar requirements to make sure that if these objective, unambiguous conditions were met, that it would be very likely that the products would be safe, and if they weren't, that it would be easy to audit why. So again, just following the logic of the cannabis regulations at the product level. But we'll probably talk about this a little more on what I believe is the next one, which gets into the products.
It certainly is, and so let's jump right into that. I mean, these are the guidelines for purity, concentration, active compounds. And for me, I know I was always, I never really understood why there was so much emphasis on packaging and products when it came to cannabis. So, I'll just hand it right over to you here. Would you like to expand on what we're talking about in part 5 here about psilocybin products?
Yes, happy to. So basically, and there are a million details in what psilocybin products are, and how we've built in controls and limits to make them safe. And again, we followed. It's very convenient that a gram of psilocybin mushrooms has a little bit less than 10 milligrams of psilocybin in it. They're a little under 1% psilocybin generally. Normal cubensis that are kind of average in the Canadian illicit market will be around 1%. So taking the logic that probably any single dosage form didn't need to be more psilocybin in that single dosage form than about a gram to make dosing more intuitive and easier for people that are used to thinking in terms of dried fruiting bodies, we decided to make 10 milligrams a limit, just as it is in the cannabis regulations, for either one dose of a psilocybin extract product, or which would be like a capsule with psilocybin in it, whether that's from a fungal like dried fruiting body source or extracted from that source or dried, or whether it's synthetic, it would be 10 milligrams per dosage unit. And following the logic and rationale of the cannabis regulations, we decided on about 10 milligrams per container, not about exactly 10 milligrams per container limit, consistent with the lead in cannabis, because we felt that probably of all the types of products, edible psilocybin products like chocolate bars or tea bags, tea being most likely what we think would be popular, that those would be limited to 10 milligrams because they're more likely to be consumed knowingly or unknowingly of their psilocybin content by minors or other people who might find them and not realize what they are. We also, I believe it's in the next channel or the next part, we'll talk about good production practices, another standard we borrowed from cannabis. We might as, or sorry, package and labeling, right? So packaging and labeling, we agreed would also follow the lead from cannabis, and the packaging is important. Like, I'm going to hold up a cannabis product here. It's not important exactly which product I'm holding up, but this package, it does two things. It does not attract children. There's nothing about it that's engaging to young people, I hope anyway. Then that was the intention of the bareness of it. But it also provides information. It provides warning labels, which are appropriate, because some of these products, while they're used therapeutically, do have risks, and it is important to inform people of those risks on the product itself, so that if the person does actually see the product, and we'll get to this in medical access, that they have one last chance to remember that what they're doing does have potential consequences, and there are things they should be aware of. But more importantly, perhaps, than the warning, is where the illicit market does not deliver, is showing the amount of psilocin and psilocybin that would be in each product, so that the person knows how much is being used. And when I say the person, I could mean their healthcare practitioner, because unlike cannabis, a lot of this usage will be supervised, but then also the individual who's assessing the product and deciding whether the amount that they're going to use makes sense for them or not. And with a container of dried fruiting bodies, it might be simpler to show the amount per gram as well as the total amount in the package, or it might be just per gram like cannabis. That part is could be done a little differently, because it's potentially, I see it as more likely than with cannabis that each container will be intended to be opened only one time. I doubt there'll be people that are returning to a container of dried fruiting bodies because it'd be perhaps unclear how much is left. That, of course, would not be as much of an issue with extracts or other products that have clear individual dosages.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, David. And as you mentioned in the last bit, I mean, what we've seen with the around 60 participants or 60 clients who have gotten access to psilocybin is certainly that, you know, all of them wish there was a better way to access it. And most of them are taking it in a tea or capsulated form, usually about 10 milligrams at a time, 10 to 5 milligrams, because that is the easiest way for them to, you know, take a little bit more, see how it's sitting with them, and kind of move from there. Many patients do also sometimes prefer to take smaller doses too, just to understand how psilocybin is going to affect them. So all of these, you know, understandably do need to be put into these regulations to allow for the people that are going to be using psilocybin to have the best possible access to products that are in line with how they want to use them and how their doctor and therapist are suggesting they use them. So the next part here is about retention of documents and information. So part 7 and 8 of these proposed regulations, there are strict requirements regarding the documentation, reporting, and disclosure maintained and retained by license holders. So the license holder is required to retain documentation information in a manner that will allow audits to be made in a timely manner. There's also documents and information that may be required by the health minister at any time. And Jim, I actually think I wanted to move over to you for to comment on this. I mean, why is reporting? Why is this documents and information so important to a government that might be putting together regulations like this?
Basically, so they can cover their ass. But you know, I always loved. I used to negotiate treaties in Canada, and there was this one wonderful line in the treaty that says, "You will provide on an annual basis a complete report to the government of Canada, or as requested." And I used to say, well, why would we have this as or as requested? And the guy from the government was very honest and said, because we probably won't even look at the first one you send in and we'll probably lose it. But no, it basically the reporting aspects of it are to allow the government to have documentation from you that says you followed the rules. And I'm sure David has a far better answer to this and a far more intellectual answer to it. But my experience in government is that when government asks for a report on anything, it's similar to when a bank asks you a report on something. It's to cover them and make sure that they're not the ones that are accused of making the mistakes that you are. And so, but also I guess too with this, it also provides a legal backup, I guess, if they decide to come after you. If you have not done things that you've apparently reported that you have, you've then lied on or falsified a government form, and God knows none of us are allowed to do that. So.
I mean, and I believe it's just there to hold the companies that are engaged in this accountable to track what they're doing, so that all the psilocybin being produced and distributed can be accounted for. I mean, part of the conventions that Canada is party to require quotas of controlled substances that are manufactured, and adhering to those international obligations to be simplified with this reporting. And you're correct, it's to make sure that if there is something that goes wrong, there's accountability. And I think anyone who is proposing to service this space and cultivate psilocybin mushrooms and prepare psilocybin products from those fruiting bodies or mycelia or whatever they're doing, or synthetic psilocybin, there has to be accountability. I mean, they're turning controlled substances into products. Those products don't have DINs, they don't have a therapeutic indication. They're being sold for medical purposes nonetheless, a concept we're familiar with from cannabis. And there's got to be accountability. I believe it's a critical aspect to this, and part of making sure it's plausible to the regulator, because otherwise the risk of diversion would be increased, the risk of any abuse of the system would be increased.
Thank you very much, David.
Told you he'd say it a lot nicer than I did.
All right. So for the last part here, and this is really, I think, the most important part, save the best for last, but it is true. And I think it's important in seeing that in order to get to this point, which is how do people actually access psilocybin for medical purposes, it does take 8 other sections in order to make this possible. But this is the part where we go through and explain how individuals can obtain access to medical psilocybin. So it outlines how healthcare providers, how they would be able to write medical documents for patients seeking access to medical psilocybin, and also how patients with valid medical documents can obtain psilocybin from a license holder. So this section also outlines the regulations for personal production, which I know that many people have asked about, essentially pertaining to how you might be able to grow or designate a grower. So I guess just to start off here, Jim, what has it been like through Section 56 trying to get access to psilocybin?
Easy but scary. You know, it's readily available on the market, but you don't know what you're buying. I'm not a gardener. I don't really want to be a gardener. I don't, I pick mushrooms out in the forest and then throw them out when I get home because I'm terrified to eat them. And so I think that the access for patients and so on through a regulated process is absolutely critical. But at the same time, I've got to say that, just to get psilocybin, we don't need the government, but to get psilocybin safely, we do. And the government should be our partner in this, and ensuring that there's a regulated supply and that supply is safe and that people can rely upon it to be as it is. Just a small example, the difference between certain mushrooms and say penis envy mushrooms, which are up to double or 2.5 times as strong. I didn't know that. I could have sat down and woofed down some mushrooms and been on something that I may not have had the ability to control. So we have to start to look at this in a far more regulated medicinal way. And I think that these regulations are exactly what's going to do that. And this is how we accomplish it, through legal means and through the government not being our grandparents and starting to be facilitators of what could be one of the most dramatic and dynamic new mental health tools available to us today. And wouldn't that be nice? Maybe after the election, not this week, that's for sure.
Well, it certainly would be nice. And I guess it makes sense for me to add a little bit here. I mean, Jim, while we've been supporting you with your exemption, we've also, been operating for going on about 2 years now. And to be running an entire team for 2 years of nurses to do intake, of a fantastic communications director to make sure that the government is not able to ignore the Section 56 requests, right? Having a research director following up with patients, making sure that their treatment is going well. It really does take an army in order to do this. So these regulations are a movement away from needing an organization to only fulfill the needs of a small fraction of Canadians to something that is, again, back to the reasons we wanted to do this. The fundamental ones is safer and more equitable or sort of equal, so that all Canadians may get access. So David, this really is the last point here, and I just wanted to put it over to you. Under the new regulations, or these proposed regulations, how would an individual and a healthcare practitioner go about getting access to psilocybin?
Well, a healthcare practitioner would write a medical access document for their patient, and then their patient would be able to register that medical access document with a license holder to purchase psilocybin products. Or that patient could take their medical document and send it to the minister so that they could get a registration certificate to cultivate their own psilocybin mushrooms. Now, it could also be, and this is an option in the cannabis regulations, this is seldom used. It's used more with minors. The healthcare practitioner themselves could receive the psilocybin products rather than the person who's going to use them. And that, because cannabis, the way it's used medically, it tends to be more self-directed, without supervision and daily. I think we're going to see contrast from that in this system, if it's implemented, in that the individuals who are involved are going to be using psilocybin infrequently and likely under supervision. I mean, with cluster headaches, there's some argument for microdosing and using it using it on a regular basis, but at smaller amounts or even larger amounts with some people who have severe headaches or pain. I think the majority of medical access documents that would be written under this system, though, would be to accelerate psychotherapy, because that's where we're seeing the most research, that's where we're seeing the most evidence of efficacy, and that's where we're seeing frankly the most illicit use as well. Illicit use in a therapeutic context is primarily in the interest of accelerating psychotherapy. So I think that the option to have the healthcare practitioner receive the psilocybin products is going to be a more popular option in this context than we've seen with cannabis. So to answer you very briefly and in a nutshell, it would be by the medical practitioner, the healthcare practitioner would write a medical access document for their patient, and then the patient would use that either to purchase psilocybin products, which would be delivered directly to them or to their healthcare practitioner, or they would register their medical document with Health Canada so that they could cultivate their own psilocybin mushrooms. And I'll also add that this system we're proposing is federal, and it would make it possible for these medical documents to be written, and it would make it possible for the products to be sold. However, the terms on which medical access would actually be given would depend from healthcare practitioner to healthcare practitioner in their professional judgment. And of course, some colleges would be free to either restrict or openly endorse this practice, and that would be up to the regulators in each province. And I think that's part of the beauty of this system, because like cannabis, it allows the various provincial colleges to control access by regulating their professionals. And then which professionals would be able to write these documents? We've stuck to the definitions in the cannabis regulations. I've heard many people point out that in their view, it would be better if more different types of professionals like psychotherapists or social workers or counselors could also give access. And I think the regulations could be written that way. And then again, it would come down to whether the individual colleges are on board, because besides the products themselves being regulated, these professionals would have to comply with their ethical obligations and with any bylaws of their college.
Thank you very much, David. And that certainly did answer quite a few of the questions that I had seen. I know that, again, for many people that may not be very familiar with the cannabis regulations, many questions come up, when they look at these proposed psilocybin regulations. Why talk about growing it? Why talk about security, safety? Why talk about who's able to provide this? And I think what I like to remind folks of is that what we're trying to do here is start off with something incredibly administratively easy, which the government has already accepted when it comes to cannabis, and then trying to apply that to psilocybin. So really starting off with getting the door open a crack, so that at minimum the patients and people who need access to psilocybin now can get access through a system that works better than Section 56. So with that, I do want to wrap up the explanation of the documents, and again remind everyone that you can go to TheraPsil.ca/AM or APMPR first draft proposed .ca, and you should be able to find that link. Again, we've also put it into the chat here. There is one question that's come up here, and Holly, if you want to let us know any of the questions that have come up in the chat or anything like that, we can answer them. But I guess one of the questions here, and Jim and David, feel free, either one of you, to answer this, is following public consultation, what are the next major steps in getting this to become fully lawful, hopefully?
David.
Well, really, it just would take the political interest to bring these regulations into effect, to make them law, and to make it happen. I mean, with cannabis, we had a set of motivators that I don't think are present here because of the widespread use and the interest in protecting children. In this case, I think it's purely to get medical access to something, which is why we're not talking about any sort of adult use system. We're talking only about therapeutic use. And I think it just takes the political will and an understanding and knowledge that probably there's an argument to be made that you could safely responsibly and in a controlled fashion give access to psilocybin for medical and therapeutic uses with the approval of a healthcare practitioner in a quality controlled fashion without necessarily running everything through clinical trials. And we will see clinical trials and we will see drug products with psilocybin as the active ingredient, but this system could allow a different type of access and perhaps a type of access for different applications. And again, the applications that it's acceptable to write medical documents for would depend on the colleges. So I think, Les, with any movement forward in law and regulation, the main thing this takes is political will and support from constituents, support from Canadians, and an understanding from stakeholders that this really is a good move and that this would make our country better and that this would alleviate suffering. And when I say this, I mean a regulated access to psilocybin that is safe, equal, and predictable.
Yeah, thank you, David. And it's really the truth of it. I mean, this is something that the Minister of Health really need only snap their fingers and it could go into effect. But the process by which that is done is lobbying, it is advocacy, it's making sure that this is worth the time of politicians, and that there's less risk in doing it than not doing it. And so making it clear that at this point there are Canadians who are suffering, who are willing to go to court if they're not listened to and if their rights are not realized, is what we want to do, and we want to make sure that their voices are heard loud and clear. So we will be preparing this for the existing or new health minister once the election's over, as part of a briefing, and making sure that this is not something that can be pushed under the rug, and that it gets the answers that it needs. So again, being clear that there are thousands of Canadians that have reached out to us that are seeking this support. It needs to be a huge part of our messaging, and it really is just the tip of the iceberg as far as the advocacy work that we have to do, because if the federal government does accept this, as you pointed out, next to the colleges and to the provinces, luckily research, public opinion, and patient stories are on our side here to make sure that this continues to move in the right direction, so long as we can continue to facilitate it safely.
I also think, Spencer, that, and correct me if I'm wrong, David, but I don't think this is a change in law that would require a parliamentary debate or legislation. I think this can be done by order in council of the Governor General. I think that all we need is a government in favor of this, and they can do this through cabinet. And because we're not asking for any huge structural changes. It's been, you've drafted very cleverly, David, and it's wonderful because it precludes the need to go back into Parliament with it, and the ability for the minister to make a recommendation to cabinet and cabinet to just accept that recommendation.
Yeah, when we were preparing this, we intentionally prepared regulations that could be brought into existence without any amendment of any act. No amendment to the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, no amendment to the Food and Drugs Act, simply new regulations, which would look a lot like cannabis regulations, which would stack on top of a licensed dealer, and which would be implemented using a system that would be very familiar to the regulator who's got a blueprint from cannabis. Another, and I feel important aspect to this, is that we also proposed moving psilocybin and psilocin from the restricted drug schedule of the Food and Drug Regulations to the controlled drug schedule of the Food and Drug Regulations, in recognition that there is a medical application here. And also, if there ever were any interest in expanding this system to include other active substances, that would also be relatively administratively simple, because there'd now be a new group of substances in the controlled drug regulations. That's not something I necessarily think would ever happen, but if there were interest in doing that, and perhaps there would with at least one other compound, then the framework would be there to simply create a set of regulations for that compound and add it to the controlled list from the restricted list as well. And then the other thing that I think was important here is we also drafted a short regulation that would exempt psilocybin products from application of the Food and Drugs Act in an identical fashion to the way cannabis products are exempted from the Food and Drugs Act.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Thank you very much. And then there's one last question here that I believe we can all answer is, can you clarify the federal regulations? Would they permit individual colleges to create their own guidelines or not for members of their college? And can we foresee any unintentional restrictions for colleges based on these regulations?
I think the colleges will do what they want. I mean, we all know, most people who follow the cannabis industry understand that it is more difficult to get medical access in Quebec than it is in most other provinces, particularly Alberta, Ontario, BC, where the colleges have been pretty open to allowing physicians to do this. I think we would see exactly the same pattern. Some colleges would view it as helpful, other colleges would view it as risky and dangerous, and they would put up different guidelines, which would be permissive or restrictive on the professionals they regulate. Now, I'm saying colleges, that would certainly include the College of Physicians or physicians and surgeons in each province. And then if during implementation and adoption of these regulations, and this would have to be done at the drafting stage, other types of healthcare practitioners were authorized by the federal regulations we're proposing to write medical documents, then those healthcare practitioners colleges would also be able to outline rules about when, how much, how often, tracking, follow-up, data collection. And I really believe that there's a stronger opportunity to collect data in this space than there was with cannabis, because of the higher level of physician involvement and the higher level of supervised use that I personally would predict relative to cannabis that we'd see if this system were implemented. So there would be a significant amount of control by the colleges over the circumstances under which medical access documents are written.
And I would say that we're already seeing, right, that already in my view, there's considerable amount of research going into psilocybin use, perhaps more than cannabis. Would you say so?
I believe so. And I mean, certainly higher quality research, but that's also because there's a lot of work being done around the world to bring psilocybin as an active pharmaceutical ingredient to market in a drug product. For example, a drug product that would be regulated in Canada under the Food and Drug Regulations. And nothing about our proposed regulations would prevent or be inconsistent with that. And I just think you'd see probably for some indications and in some colleges and with some healthcare practitioners, there'd be a preference for prescription drugs. And that would make a lot of sense, especially when insurance considerations are brought into play. And in other cases, maybe this medical access system would make more sense for the patient. I just think we have to really think about what's best for the patients here and bear in mind the historical context we're in, which is that these substances have been prohibited for a long time. There's perceived therapeutic benefit, perceived efficacy, there's perceived safety. And as a result, we are seeing lots of illicit use. And that's the other thing to remember here is this is happening right now anyway. And when I say this, I mean, there are therapists out there who are risking their license and risking their ability to practice their profession in order to help their patients by giving them psilocybin, or if the patient brings psilocybin, by cooperating with use of that psilocybin in a therapeutic context. And I don't think those individuals are doing so in a misguided fashion. I think there's the criticism that one should follow the rules of conduct for one's profession, but that outside of that idea aside rather, I think these individuals are acting from their perspective in the best interests of their patients. And if we Canadians of Canada can provide a compliant, above board, traceable, quantified, safer, because there's no such thing as a safe drug, but eliminate the danger that is inherent in sourcing an illicit product, both in the product itself and in the circumstances under which you access it, eliminating those dangers, can only help. And if this is going to be happening anyway, then I see some logic in this type of system, because we wouldn't even be here having this discussion if there weren't some plausibility to it. And while the minister is very clear when they write exemptions that it is not an endorsement of psilocybin, one can't ignore the fact that the exemptions were nonetheless written.
Mhm. Very well said.
Sorry, I was muted there. Jim and David, thank you so much for joining us again. I know this is probably like the third webinar that you've joined us, both of you on, so thank you so much.
We're a team now. I mean, David and I are taking this on the road, you know.
Well, hopefully we can, and we can get this to officials in Ottawa once this election is cleared up. And speaking of which, I know there is a debate tonight, so for anyone who's interested, check that out, and certainly check out the rest of our webinars that we've both recorded on YouTube, and we'll continue to be doing over the next couple of weeks. So David and Jim, again, thank you so much. And I'll just put it to you both if you have any closing thoughts. So maybe Jim, over to you quick.
Vote early, vote often.
Thank you. And David, for yourself.
No, I feel I've spoken far too much already. Thanks for having me, and I'm very excited to see where this goes.
Awesome. Well, thank you, and to everyone in the audience as well. Thank you so much for attending this. Really, the reason we put public education as one of our core pillars on our mission is because if you really want to know how, what are the next steps, it is educating the public, making sure that people are aware and can themselves become advocates and vote, as Jim said, for what they want, and make sure they demand, their rights from their government. So thank you very much for all your support. And I do want to remind everyone that we do have a fundraiser that's still open for another 7 days as well. So for the next 7 days, any funds that are donated to TheraPsil are doubled because of a generous donor we've got. And I think you can actually still receive a bottle of soap as well from Dr. Bronner's. So if you or anyone you know wishes to support this, please consider donating to that fundraiser. So yeah, thank you so much. Thank you everyone for attending. And I look forward to the next webinar. That'll be next Wednesday, same time. So take care, everyone.